Texas, 1873. The wind swept across Dust River, carrying the dry scent of earth and the creak of rusted hinges. The house at the end of the red dirt road was barely a shelter anymore. It was the remnants of something that had once been called a family. The door swayed in the breeze. The porch sagged to one side, and 4 children huddled beneath the faint shadow, as if even the house itself no longer wanted to hold them. Ava stood in the yard, bare feet caked with mud, her hands gripping the ragged shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She was only 19, but there was nothing of girlhood left in her eyes. Just the dull numbness that comes after too many hungry nights, too many shouted insults for no reason, too many slaps from the hands that were supposed to love her. Not far off, the rickety wooden wheels of the wagon had already disappeared over the horizon. Caleb and Loretta Hanley. Her parents had taken the whiskey, a few pieces of silver they could still sell, and left behind everything they considered dead weight, 5 children. Not a goodbye. Not a final embrace. Just a flick of Loretta's wrist that knocked the youngest child to the ground when she clung to her mother's skirt. Loretta never looked back. Ava didn't cry, not because she didn't want to, but because the tears had dried up long ago from the nights she went without dinner, so her brother could eat from the times she curled under the table, while her father shouted at ghosts and slammed doors. The pain had scarred over, and scars don't bleed anymore. She knelt beside the youngest, who sobbed in silence. One arm pulled the child close. The other stroked her back in a gesture no one had taught her. The other children stood nearby, not asking questions, only waiting for Ava to say something they could believe in. But Ava said nothing. She knew that any promise made now would blow away like dust. She simply looked toward the ruined house, the lopsided roof slanting like a final breath, and whispered to herself, "That name is no longer mine." Hanley, the name people had used for her at school, at church, whenever they pointed or whispered, was now nothing but a stain she wanted to scrub out, like pulling a thorn from her chest. If anyone asked who she was, she'd say only Eva. No last name, no lineage, nothing left to bind her. That first night after being left behind, Eva built a fire from damp branches and rotting porch wood. The flame sputtered, throwing more smoke than light, but she still pulled her siblings close, giving them what warmth she could from a body already drained. No blankets, no stove. But at least they had each other. In that darkness, beneath the roof of a house that had already given up, Eva made a choice. She could collapse, or she could rise. And she chose to rise, not for herself, but for the 4 small bodies clinging to her, trembling. They had never known real love, but Eva was determined they would not grow up with the same hollow ache that had shaped her life. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Didn't know when hunger might finally steal her strength. But one thing she did know with certainty. She was no longer the daughter of Caleb and Loretta Hanley. She was only Eva, a name unfinished, but one she would complete with her own 2 hands. The next morning felt no different from the night before, except that the small fire Eva had built had gone completely cold, leaving behind a pile of ash in the yard. Her younger brother coughed in shallow bursts, and little Lily burned with a low fever, her body hot and heavy in Eva's arms. Hunger no longer stabbed. It simply settled into her like a second skin. Eva wasn't afraid anymore, just numb. Desperation, when it lasts long enough, deadens the mind, the same way frostbite deadens the skin. It was in that moment that Calder Reed appeared. He rode his horse down the red dirt road that led through the forgotten edge of Dust River, a place most folks had stopped caring about. No one knew exactly why he passed through just then. Maybe one of his cattle had wandered this way. Maybe it was just habit for a man who lived closer to the earth than to people. Calder Reed, a quiet rancher alone on the hillside with more acres than words. As his horse slowed near the collapsed house, he saw them 5 small figures huddled under a crooked porch, like scraps left behind by a passing storm. The oldest girl stood the tallest, unflinching, her eyes so steady even the wind seemed to hesitate. He didn't dismount, just tipped his hat. "You kids all right?" he asked, voice low and gravelly, like a breath pulled through dry prairie grass. Ava didn't answer, just stared back, eyes like stone in a dried-up creek bed, holding no hope, no fear, nothing left to expect from the world. Calder didn't press, didn't ask more, just gave a small nod, turned his horse and disappeared into the blur of dust. Eva didn't expect to see him again, but that evening, returning from scavenging a few sticks near the tree line, she found a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, resting quietly on the rotting porch step. A piece of bread, a canteen of water, and a few strips of dried meat. No note, no sign of who'd left it. She looked around, only wind and dust. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the cloth, not out of fear, but because no one had ever left her anything without expecting something back. Kindness for Eva had always come with a price. The next morning, a neat stack of dry firewood sat by the porch, no longer the damp, splintering kind she had to wrestle apart with raw fingers. Just a few logs split clean. But to Eva, it might as well have been a miracle. And so it continued. A can of beans, a sack of salt, a worn but clean blanket. No one ever knocked. No one stood waiting. And most of all, no one asked for thanks. At first, Ava didn't trust it. She had been fed before, only to be hit later for being ungrateful. She had been offered shelter only to be thrown out into the night. But this came without follow-up, no stare of judgment, no tired sighs. And then one evening, she waited. Hidden behind the cracked well, Ava held her breath as Calder appeared again, placing another bundle by the porch like it was routine. She stepped out just as he turned to leave. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice didn't shake, but it was soft, as if afraid the question might break the fragile calm just beginning to settle. Calder paused, glanced over his shoulder. "Because someone ought to. That's not a reason," she said quietly. He gave a faint smile. "Maybe not, but it's enough." Ava studied him a little longer. What she felt wasn't quite gratitude. Not yet. It was a cautious kind of thankfulness, like trying to cup a small flame in your hands without snuffing it out. "I don't have a last name," she said finally. Calder's response was simple. "I didn't ask." Then he turned his horse again. This time his gaze lingered just a second longer before he rode away. 3 days after their last meeting, Eva stood at the old wooden gate of Calder's ranch. Dawn had not yet broken. The pale silver threads of mist still clung to the grass like spider silk. In her hands was a bundle bread, a blanket salt each item, something Calder had left for her in silence. She set the bundle down, adjusted the patchwork hem of her dress, and knocked once on the gatepost, soft but firm. Calder stepped out from the barn hay, clinging to his shoulders. He looked at her, not surprised, not eager, just quietly said, "You came." Eva nodded. "I came to return what doesn't belong to me." Calder glanced at the bundle, then looked back at her. "If it's about giving it back, he said you could have buried it instead." "I'm not a beggar," she replied, her voice straight, as the spine she refused to let collapse under hunger and exhaustion. Calder was silent for a moment, then bent down, picked up the bundle, and placed it back in her arms. "Then take it, and work." Ava frowned. "Work what?" He pointed to the yard, scattered with cow, dung, straw, and wild weeds. "Start with the job no one else wants." From that day forward, each early morning before the sun broke over the hills, Eva walked from the broken-down house to Calder's ranch. No one told her she had to come early, but she always did. She started by sweeping the yard, gathering moldy straw, scattering ash around tree roots. Then she hauled water from the well, pouring it into the trough for the cattle, her hands trembling from the cold, but never a single complaint. In the afternoons, she scrubbed the kitchen floor, scoured old rusted pans, sometimes mended children's coats with borrowed needle and thread from the bakery lady in town. Calder didn't lecture her, didn't encourage her either. He just handed her a broom, a bucket, a dull knife to cut twine. and strangely Ava felt more at ease than she ever had when someone helped her. No one looked at her like a stray pup. No one pitied her with their eyes. No one gave charity wrapped in guilt, and because of that, she was free to work, to ache, to earn free to feel like she wasn't a burden. Her hands, once only used to shield her siblings, were now rough from dried dung, blistered from hauling water, nicked by sharp weeds. And the more they hurt, the more she knew she was alive. Because for the first time, she wasn't something someone had to carry. She was standing on her own. One afternoon, while she stirred a soup made from leftover bones, Calder came into the kitchen, sat at the table, and watched the pot boil. He didn't say a word, just handed her a small bundle of dried leaves. Toss that in, it'll sweeten the broth. Ava took it, dropped the herbs in her hands, trembling from the steam. After a moment, her voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "You've never asked my full name." Calder leaned his chin on his hand-eyes on the fire. "Sometimes, asking someone's name is like poking a wound that's still bleeding." Eva didn't answer. But that night, when she returned home, she wrapped her little sister in a blanket and for the first time told her about the soup she didn't burn. Her voice was soft, but in it was something reborn self-respect. Through small unseen acts, without applause or reward, Eva began to rebuild the self that had been ground down by the adults who were supposed to protect her. And Calder he didn't teach with words. He taught with a clean bucket, left in reach, a hoe laid out by the porch, a hot meal served without judgment. He became part of the quiet foundation she was laying beneath her own 2 feet. Ava still didn't carry anyone's name, but now she could say with certainty she was no longer the one left behind. She was the one who had chosen to rise. Time passed like dust settling softly on the wooden fences of Calder's ranch, and just as quietly as grass growing along the edge of the well, something between Eva and Calder began to take root. No name, no promises, but undeniably real. Calder never asked about her past. He didn't bring up old wounds. He never questioned why a young woman was raising 4 children alone. He didn't touch the scars on her arms, or the silences between her hesitant answers. And somehow that restraint became the gentlest comfort she had ever known. One morning, like every morning, Ava arrived early and saw a wide-brimmed hat hanging on the fence. It was old, but sturdy. No note. No one handing it to her. But she knew it was meant for her, for the girl who worked in the sun, like fallow soil waiting for rain. She put it on that day, and worked until dusk touched the roof of the barn. A few days later, a pair of worn boots appeared by the shed door, her exact size. She tried them on. They fit better than the patched slippers she'd been wearing. No one mentioned the gift. Ava didn't thank him, but that evening when she set the table, she quietly placed a wildflower next to Calder's plate, not as payment, but as a silent nod. That's how they lived, like 2 people tending the same pasture in a season of high winds. No confessions, no demands, just the steady rhythm of shared work and quiet presence. Each day Calder handed her a bucket, a broom, or a handful of seeds. Each day Eva took them, finished the task, and walked back to the broken house, where 4 small faces waited, their eyes growing brighter with each meal that carried salt and warmth. Sometimes in the evenings, Calder hammered nails into the barn wall, while Eva sat by the fire mending her siblings' sleeves. They didn't speak. Only the soft crackle of the fire and the calm breathing of people, too used to loneliness and learning how to live beside another again. Once Calder left behind a thick patchwork blanket on the porch. Eva, hesitant but proud, tucked a coin, the only one she owned, into a scrap of cloth and laid it beside the folded gift. The next morning, the coin was still there, but the blanket was gone. And that's when Eva understood real kindness doesn't send you the bill. Another day, exhausted and slumped beside the water trough, Eva didn't explain or complain. Calder didn't ask if she was all right. He simply handed her a cool tin of water. She drank it, nodded once, and got back to work. And as the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods, she watched him walk the cattle back to the barn and thought, this is a man who's never made promises, but never left her alone. In that silence, trust was built layer by layer, like the fence line Calder kept extending around the pasture, slow, steady, and strong enough to hold against the wind. No declarations of love, no lingering touches, no wistful glances like in dime novels. Just a bucket placed where it needed to be, a feed bag restocked, one person cooking, the other sweeping. And somewhere amid all those unnamed gestures, Eva began to feel something she had never dared to believe in safety. Not because Calder protected her, but because he never made her be weak to be worthy of care. In the firelight, in the warmth of a blanket, in the breeze that no longer cut as sharply through her coat, Eva wasn't just surviving anymore. She was quietly, patiently building a life piece by piece from the small, steady things Calder had laid beside her. That afternoon, the wind blew in from the south, carrying red dust and the heavy creak of wagon wheels. Eva was splitting wood behind the barn when she saw a strange wagon stop at the gate of Calder's ranch. The stench of old sweat and animal grease clung to the two men, who climbed down, one with a scraggly beard and a grin like a rusted blade, the other a boy with a young face but eyes as dull and lifeless as a dry well. The older man wore a tattered black coat, a crude emblem stitched to his chest. 3 antlers crossed the mark of her mother's family, blood by name. But none of them had ever sent a bag of beans, a letter, or a helping hand when she needed it most. "You must be Eva," the man said, voice slick and soupy. "Loretta's girl. Heard what happened, broke our hearts. We're here for the little ones. Family ought to be with family." Eva didn't answer right away. Her hand stayed tight around the axe handle, her eyes locked on him like she could stare him into dust. Just then, Calder stepped out from the main house. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't angry. But there was something in the way he stood, feet planted, eyes steady, that made the wind seem to pause mid-breath. "They're not sacks of grain for you to haul off when your hands are short," Calder said, voice calm, but taut like a rope drawn tight. The man chuckled, tipping his chin. "We've got land. We've got rights. The blood in those kids runs from my line." "Blood," Calder repeated. "Blood washes away after a hard rain. Only the ones who stay behind keep the roots alive." The man's smile faded. "You got no papers, no wedding, no claim. You can't call them yours." Eva stepped forward, then her hands dusty with wood shavings, hair loose down her back, but her spine straight and eyes unmoved. Her siblings watched silently from behind the door, clutching each other tight. "I don't belong to anyone," Eva said, not loud, but solid, like a hammer striking stone. "I'm the one who stayed when they walked away. I'm the hand that wiped their foreheads when they burned with fever. I'm the back that blocked the wind, the voice that sang lullabies through the night." She turned to Calder. "And this man, he never promised me anything, but he never left either." Then she took his hand, calloused, warm, steady as rock weathered by storms. She gripped it as if everything she'd ever feared was dissolving in the certainty of that touch. "My name," she said, turning back to the man, "is Eva Boon. I chose it with my heart. No one gave it to me, and no one gets to take it away." A strange silence fell over the yard. The man pressed his lips together, colorless like cooled ash. The boy slumped in the wagon seat, staring at his feet. From nearby homes, the sounds of the blacksmith's hammer of butter being spread at the bakery, of boots on wooden porches, all drifted into the still air. Neighbors stepped out onto stoops, leaned from windows. No one spoke. But the way they looked at Eva, not like a child, but like someone who had chosen rightly, said everything. The man snorted, spat near the fence post, and climbed back onto the wagon. The wheels turned slow and grudging, hauling away blood that nobody wanted anymore. That night, Eva didn't cry. She didn't shake. She simply sat by the window of the small house, moonlight spilling through the gaps in the boards. Later, she found a small wooden plank hanging on a beam in the barn, carved with uneven but careful letters, Eva Boon. No decorations, no flourishes. Just her name etched as a truth, not a question. Standing under that moon fingers, tracing the edge of the wood, Eva felt something loosen in her chest. She didn't need a family name to belong. Not anymore. She had her name. She had someone who stayed, and she had herself the girl who dared to choose what no one had ever offered her. The old cattle barn sat at the edge of Calder's ranch, once a resting place for rotting lumber-dried manure and broken wagons long forgotten. The wind whistled through its cracked roof like someone sighing in the dark. One early morning, Ava stood before it with a straw broom in her hand, her gaze no longer that of a survivor, but of someone about to sow something new. "What are we building here?" Calder asked, leaning against a wooden beam, his eyes steady on hers. "A school," Eva said quietly, but firmly, "for children who've never been called by their real names, like I once was." Calder nodded. He didn't ask anything more, and so they began. In the days that followed, the old barn turned into a work site for 2 people and a scattered crew of curious children. Eva swept every corner, gathered loose planks, patched the torn window flaps with old cloth. Calder carved desks out of old pine boards, built benches from broken table legs. The dust still clung to their hands, but to Eva, it no longer felt like remnants. It felt like sawdust from something beginning. One day, Calder returned from town, carrying a cracked slate chalkboard. When the blacksmith heard what it was for, he said, "Let me build it a proper frame." The bakery lady brought over some chalk, and the seamstress left a spare curtain to block the sun from the window. Word traveled fast. Within days, children from the outskirts of Dust River began to show up, some barefoot, some with torn satchels, some carrying nothing but wide eyes and names that had been mispronounced their whole lives. "Come in," Eva said, wiping her hands on her old apron. "Today we start with ourselves." She picked up a piece of chalk and wrote 2 words on the board. "Your name." Then she turned, sweeping her gaze across the dirt-smudged faces. Not for roll call, not for someone else to shout like a number, but to say, "I am here, I exist, and I deserve to be remembered." At first, some didn't dare write. Some only scribbled half a letter. One little girl's hand shook so hard she couldn't grip the chalk. But Ava never rushed them. She knelt beside each one, placed a hand on their back, and patted softly the same way she once comforted her baby sister through a fever. "Just one stroke at a time," she whispered. "Even slowly, you're making yourself real." And slowly names began to appear. Each crooked letter, a declaration. Each wobbly stroke, a part of a story that had once been taken and was now being reclaimed by small, determined hands. Calder never joined the class, but every day he quietly straightened a beam, replaced a splintered plank, or brought a full bucket of cool water. No one told him to, but every child in that room knew he was the man who never left. One afternoon, after the children had gone home, Ava lingered in the space that still smelled of hay and sweat. She picked up a piece of chalk, walked to the board, and wrote a line. "Anyone can start over if someone calls them by the right name." When she turned, Calder was leaning in the doorway, holding a freshly carved wooden sign. The letters were uneven, but firm, Boon School. "They need to see it from a distance," he said, setting the sign into place above the door. "So they know this place is theirs." Eva stepped forward, her fingers brushing the wood. It felt warm, like the palm of someone who'd spent their life in sun and weather. She didn't need to say anything. She just knew in this place that was once a cattle barn, a school had risen for children once seen as extra, as silent, as not meant to be here. And now, every morning when laughter rang out from Boon School, when chalk scratched a child's name onto the board, Eva knew more clearly than ever she was doing the right thing. That afternoon, Boon School sat quiet after a lively day of learning. The children had all gone home, leaving behind dusty little slates, a few worn notebooks tilted on benches. The late sun streamed through the window, where Eva had hung curtains from leftover fabric, bathing the modest room in gold, a room that was once a crumbling cattle barn, now a place where names were spoken right. Eva was wiping the chalkboard when she saw it, a clay-colored envelope resting on the teacher's desk. No one was around. But the name Ava, written neatly without flair, was in a handwriting she knew better than her own reflection. She opened it. Inside was a marriage license form. The groom's name had already been filled in Calder Reed. The line for her name was left blank. No love letter, no proposal, just one line penciled in soft strokes at the bottom. You can carry my name, but I've carried you in my heart for a long time. Eva sat down, her hands holding the paper, as her heart thudded in her chest. There were no flowers, no ring, just a man who had never promised anything, but had also never once left. She thought back to the days when her hand still trembled, sweeping the old barn, folding threadbare blankets for her siblings, flinching at the sound of boots coming too close. And then Calder had appeared, not like a rescuer, but like the ground beneath her feet, solid enough to rise from. He had never said I love you, never asked for anything, never tried to keep her with words. But he left the hoe leaning where she'd find it, made dinner when she was too tired, and left a space beside the fire untouched, just so she'd know she had been counted. Eva stood, picked up a piece of white chalk, still dusted from the day's lessons. She walked to the board, the same one where she had taught children to write their names. Today, for the first time, she wrote her own. Eva. She paused. Behind that name was a space where Hanley used to be the name she had walked away from. A space where a new name could go if she chose. But Eva didn't rush. Instead, she drew a single straight line beneath her first name. Not to end something, but to begin. A line for the next part of her life. When she turned around, Calder was standing in the doorway, hands dusty from the earth sleeves rolled past his elbows, just like he did on any other evening when he stopped by to fix a hinge, replace a latch, or simply watch the kids laugh. Eva walked toward him, holding the form. She didn't say I accept. She didn't ask, why me? She just handed it back, her name now, filled in clear and sure Ava Boon, but not written in the inherited scrawl of some passed-down family name. Written in her own hand, as someone who had learned to name herself from the ground up. Calder looked at it, then gave a slow nod. He didn't embrace her. He simply extended his hand like offering a tool, a hammer, or a coil of rope, as if inviting her to build something that would take both of them. You don't have to sign it, he said, voice low and steady, like earth after rain. The ranch, the school, the porch roof, they're yours either way. With or without my name, you're still home. Eva smiled. Not out of surprise, not from tears, but because she had come so far from the place where her name was only ever shouted in anger. Now she was chosen, loved without pity, and carrying a name not out of blood or duty, but because someone had quietly carried her heart through the storms. That spring came early in Dust River. New grass blanketed the hills. Magpies built nests along the southern fence line, and not even Calder could stop the children from gathering wildflowers by the armful for what they believed was the most important day of their lives. The wedding was held right there on the ranch. No church, no organ, no flowing white dress like in the storybooks. Just an arch made from pine branches and trailing vines, wildflowers handpicked by the children, dandelions, clover, a few late bluebonnets that survived the cold snap, and a patch of clean grass where the cattle once lay, now draped in old cloth hand-stitched by Eva and the town. Seamstress. Calder wore the only shirt he owned that wasn't covered in barn dust. Sleeves cuffed, face clean-shaven, but still weathered from the sun. He stood under the arch, hands folded in front of him, not looking at anyone until Eva walked up holding her little sister's hand hair, simply braided in a faded blue dress that the fabric shopkeeper had mended 5 times over. There was no music, no champagne, just the stillness that feels deeply American, the kind born from wide-open land and hearts that have known loss enough to treasure the simplest things. The officiant was the old postmaster who also read scripture on Sunday nights. He looked at the couple, didn't ask, "Do you take?" Just smiled, nodded, and stepped back. Calder looked up, and his eyes were no longer stone, they were soil-turned and ready for planting. "I don't need someone to take my name to be called family," he said, his voice quiet but clear across the open field. "I just need someone who brings the fire home and keeps it burning through the winter." No one laughed, because in Dust River fire was sacred. Fire kept you from freezing, gave your supper flavor, made life possible. Ava turned to the crowd neighbors, kids from Boon School, the baker, who once gave her a bag of flour when all she had were her hands, and then looked at Calder. Her gaze bright and unwavering. "Names can be taken," she said. "But a home is something you choose and build with your heart." From that day on, the town began calling them the Boon family. No one asked what church they wed in. No one demanded papers. No one cared whose blood ran through whose veins. They just remembered he was the man who brought firewood to a broken doorstep. And she was the girl who once had no name, now standing tall and calling her own. That night, the little kitchen in what used to be Calder's house, now called Boon House, was full of voices. The children baked cookies, hands sticky with dough, cheeks pink from laughter. Calder stoked the fire in the stove, set a pot of stew to simmer, and the scent of slow-cooked beef and dry onions filled the air. Eva stood at the table, her old cloak clean and folded back, kneading dough with a girl named Maggie, a new student at the school. Maggie had once told her she had no last name. Eva replied, "Then write your first name first. The rest your heart will fill in later." The children curled up near the stove scarves wrapped around them. Some had no last names. Some had 3 from different fathers and different pasts. But here they all had one thing in common. They were called by their real names, in voices soft and warm, like firelight. On the kitchen door, Calder had hung a wooden sign, carved in uneven but proud letters, "Boon Family. No blood, all heart." Below it, tiny painted handprints, red, yellow, blue, smudged and crooked like a handmade family crest. No one told the kids to press their hands there, but each one wanted to. Ava sat by the window cradling a warm mug of tea. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the glass, gentle and sure. In front of her was a life she once thought she'd never have, not because it was grand, but because she had built it herself. No one had handed it to her. No one had given permission. And if you reading this have ever felt like you didn't belong, ever been called the wrong name, ever felt like a burden in someone else's eyes, then let this story be something you carry, not because it's extraordinary, but because it's real somewhere out there in America's dusty heartland, where the soil is dry, but the hearts still bloom. Ava had nothing but her hands, and the belief that she wasn't excess. Calder had nothing but an old ranch, a horse, and patience. They didn't need blood to call each other home. They just needed to stay. What can you do now that you've heard their story? Support people like Eva, those who choose to rise instead of asking to be rescued. Share this story if you believe family is something we choose, not something we're chained to. And if your name has ever felt like a weight, try writing it again on a board, a page, or just in your heart, in your own handwriting. Because somewhere there's a home. Maybe it's Boon Ranch. Maybe it's the fire you've kept alive that's waiting for you to call yourself by your full name for the very first time.